The cool, smooth leather of the Cusinelli handbag felt alien in David's hands. He was a man of simple textures: worn wood, soft cotton, the crisp grain of architectural paper. This bag, a casual $5,000 purchase his wife, Isabella, had made last week, felt like a prop from a life he funded but did not fully inhabit. He was only looking for his car keys. Isabella had a habit of sweeping them up in her whirlwind exits, depositing them into the abyss of her purse alongside a universe of expensive trifles. He unzipped the main compartment, the metal teeth gliding with an obscene, buttery smoothness. Inside, a landscape of luxury, a silk-lined wallet, a gold pen, a small vial of perfume that cost more than his first car. He sifted through the contents, his fingers brushing against a stiff, folded piece of paper tucked into a side pocket. He assumed it was a receipt for the bag itself, or perhaps another bauble she'd forgotten to mention. Curiosity, a dormant and often unhelpful emotion in his marriage, stirred. He pulled out. It was not one receipt, but three, stapled neatly together. They were from the Grand Alistair, a boutique hotel downtown known for its discretion and its decadent, velvet-draped suites. The dates were recent, all within the last month. The name on the reservation was not hers. It was a Mr. Julian Croft, but the card used for payment, the last 4 digits printed in stark black ink, was instantly recognizable. It was the supplementary platinum card he had given her, the one she called her little emergency fund. The charges were not for emergencies. They were for 3 separate 2-night stays. Champagne, room service for 2, late checkout. The total ran into the thousands. David stood in the cavernous marble foyer of the home he had designed and built, the receipts trembling slightly in his hand. The air, usually filled with the faint scent of lilies Isabella insisted upon, suddenly felt thin, stripped of oxygen. A profound and terrible stillness settled over him. It wasn't the fiery rage of a betrayed husband from the movies. It was something colder, quieter, and far more absolute. It was the chilling clarity of a complex equation finally being solved. All the variables, the late charity meetings, the sudden weekend trips with the girls, the faint, dismissive tone in her voice when he asked about her day, they all clicked into place, forming a perfect, ugly picture. Isabella believed her husband was a simple man, a quiet, predictable architect who was good with numbers and blessedly unambitious in the glittering social world she navigated. She saw him as the sturdy, unadorned foundation upon which her beautiful, elaborate life was built. She never thought to inspect the foundation itself. She didn't know he wasn't just the foundation. He was the architect, the engineer, the builder, and the sole, silent owner of the entire edifice. And in his meticulously ordered world, a world built on precision and integrity, there was no room for a structural flaw this profound. These receipts were not just proof of infidelity. They were a catastrophic engineering report, and he was the only one who knew the whole building was about to come down. I hope you're settling in, because this is a story about what happens when a man who builds empires is treated like a man who simply pays the bills. If you enjoy seeing patience and quiet strength overcome arrogance, you're in the right place. Do me a favor and hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. And just for fun, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to the moment the first crack appeared in the facade. The memory, unbidden, surfaced with the crystalline clarity of a recurring nightmare. It was from 2 weeks ago at a dinner party Isabella had insisted on hosting. The guest list was a constellation of her social firmament: minor celebrities, trust fund heirs, and people whose primary occupation was being seen at the right places. David, in his well-made but understated navy suit, moved through the glittering crowd like a ghost. He was the host, the provider of the vintage champagne and the Michelin-starred catering, yet he felt like a hired hand. He was standing near the grand piano, nursing a glass of sparkling water, when Isabella's parents, Richard and Eleanor, cornered him. Richard, a man who had inherited a respectable sum and spent his life cultivating an air of aristocratic boredom, clapped David on the shoulder with a familiarity that never quite reached his eyes. "David, my boy," he began, his voice a smooth, condescending purr. "Still slaving away over those blueprints of yours?" "I enjoy the work, Richard," David replied, his tone even. He had long ago learned that engaging with Richard's provocations was a futile exercise. Eleanor, draped in diamonds that glittered like shards of ice, let out a delicate, tinkling laugh. "Oh, let it be, dear. We can't all be adventurers. Someone has to keep the lights on." The insult was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, wrapped in a silken sheath of faux sympathy. Isabella glided over to them, a vision in red silk. She looped her arm through David's, but the gesture felt like an act of possession, not affection. "Daddy, Mother, stop teasing him," she said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "David's work is very meticulous." She said the word meticulous as if it were a synonym for dull. "He was showing me some drawings for a new library or something the other day. So many straight lines." She turned to her parents, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper he was clearly meant to overhear. "Honestly, I don't know how he does it. Staring at a computer all day. I go absolutely mad." Richard chuckled. "Well, it pays for this, doesn't it?" He made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the soaring ceilings, the curated art on the walls, the very air of effortless wealth that permeated the room. The implication was clear. David's boring, methodical work was a means to an end, and the end was Isabella's lifestyle. He was the engine, hidden away in the basement, while she was the gleaming vessel sailing in the sun. David felt a familiar, dull ache behind his ribs. It was the pain of being fundamentally unseen. They saw the house, the cars, the clothes, the vacations. They never saw the years of 17-hour days, the risks he'd taken, the complex financial structures he had designed not just to earn money, but to build a lasting legacy. They saw a quiet man in a simple suit. They had no concept of the empire he commanded from the minimalist, silent office he went to every day. In his worn leather briefcase, which Isabella often called shabby, sat the corporate seals and ownership documents for 3 holding companies, a dozen commercial properties, and a tech portfolio that analysts had recently valued in the 9-figure range. This house wasn't just in his name. It was owned by a trust he had established before he even met her, a trust so ironclad that her name appeared nowhere on the deed. She was, in the strictest legal sense, a long-term guest, a beautifully kept, exquisitely dressed guest. He remained silent through their casual humiliation, a practiced stillness his shield. He just nodded, giving them the bland, agreeable smile they expected. This was the price of his peace, he had told himself for years. He loved Isabella, or at least, the woman he thought she was beneath the shimmering, brittle surface. He had hoped that one day she would see him, the real him, that she would value his mind, his discipline, his quiet strength. He had thought his love and his provision would be enough to earn her respect. Now, standing in the foyer with the hotel receipts in his hand, he saw that hope for the delusion it was. They hadn't just underestimated him. They had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their own reality. They thought he was the court jester, there for their amusement and convenience. They were about to find out he was the king, and he was about to dissolve the court. The next morning, the sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their bedroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Isabella was still asleep, a serene, beautiful mask in the sea of white linen. Her breathing was deep and even. She looked peaceful, innocent. A year ago, the sight would have filled David with a profound sense of tenderness. This morning, it filled him with a cold, hollow emptiness. He looked at the woman he had promised to love and protect, and all he could see was a stranger. He showered and dressed in silence, his movements precise and economical. He chose a dark gray suit, a white shirt, a conservative tie. It was his armor, the uniform of the man they dismissed, the man who was about to systematically dismantle their world. He did not wake her. He did not leave a note. He simply picked up his shabby leather briefcase and walked out of the house he owned, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a final, irrevocable verdict. His office was a sanctuary of calm and order. It was a stark, minimalist space overlooking the city, furnished with clean lines and muted colors. There were no family photos on his desk. His life here was separate, a carefully guarded secret. His only companion was his longtime executive assistant, Maria, a woman of formidable efficiency and unwavering loyalty. She greeted him with a knowing look. She had worked with him for 15 years, since he was a brilliant young architect operating out of a tiny, rented room. She knew the full scope of his success, and she had seen the subtle, corrosive effect his marriage had on him. "Good morning, David," she said, her voice soft. "I have the files you requested last night." He had emailed her at 3 a.m. The subject line was simply, "Asset Restructuring." He nodded, taking the thick folder from her. "Thank you, Maria. Please hold all my calls. Unless it's Marcus Thorne." Marcus was his lawyer, a man as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. "He's already on his way up," she said. David went into his private office and closed the door. He sat behind his large, uncluttered desk and opened the folder. Inside were the documents that constituted his life's work: trust agreements, corporate ownership charts, bank statements, investment portfolios, and a single, slim file labeled Isabella. He opened it. It contained copies of every supplementary card agreement, every wire transfer for her allowance, every lease agreement for the car she drove. His name, and his alone, was at the bottom of every page. He had built her a gilded cage, and she had never even bothered to check who held the key. He picked up his phone. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel sadness. He felt a sense of purpose. He was an architect, and he had discovered a fatal flaw in his design. It was time to deconstruct. The first call was to the private banking division. The man on the other end, Mr. Davies, knew him well. Their relationship was built on years of quiet, profitable business. "David, good morning. What can I do for you?" "Good morning, Charles," David said, his voice perfectly level. "I need to make some immediate changes to my accounts. I'm canceling all supplementary cards effective immediately. Please start with the platinum card ending in 1234. Cardholder, Isabella Vance." He used her maiden name, a small, private act of severance. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Of course, David. Is there a problem? Has the card been compromised?" "Yes," David said, the word tasting like iron. "It has. I understand. I'll process that for you right now. Any others?" "All of them," David said. "Every card with her name on it. The Visa, the department store accounts, the fuel card. Liquidate them. All of them." He listened to the quiet tapping of keys as Mr. Davies executed his instructions. Each click was a brick being removed from the false edifice of their life together. He felt a strange sense of lightness, of liberation. He spent the next hour on the phone. He spoke to the manager of the building where Isabella's parents lived in a penthouse apartment he paid for, instructing him that the lease, which was up for renewal next month, would not be renewed. He spoke to the dealership, arranging for the repossession of the Range Rover she drove. It was leased in his company's name. It was a simple matter. He spoke to the treasurer of the country club, the director of the charity board she sat on, funded by his annual anonymous donation, the administrators of every single pillar that held up her glittering, effortless life. By the time Marcus Thorne walked in, his face a mask of grim professionalism, David had already demolished the entire structure. All that was left was to inform the occupant that she was living in a ruin. Marcus sat down, placing his own briefcase on the desk. "I got your email. Are you sure about this, David?" David slid one of the hotel receipts across the polished surface of the desk. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Marcus picked it up, his eyes scanning the details. He let out a low whistle. "The Grand Alistair. Not exactly subtle." He looked up at David, his expression softening from lawyer to friend. "I am sorry, Mum. I truly am." "Don't be," David said, his voice calm and steady. "This isn't a tragedy. It's a clarification." The call came, as he knew it would, just after 2 o'clock. Isabella's name flashed on his phone screen. He let it ring 4 times before answering, a small, calculated act of reclaiming power. "David." Her voice was sharp, brittle with indignation. "My card was just declined. At Chanel." Can you imagine the humiliation? David leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the city skyline. It was a clear day. He could see for miles. I can't, actually, he said, his voice a placid lake. What happened? What do you mean, what happened? It was declined. The girl behind the counter looked at me like I was a criminal. I had to leave a $5,000 handbag on the counter. A handbag? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is? That does sound unpleasant, he said, the understatement a weapon. Unpleasant? It was a nightmare. You have to call the bank. You probably forgot to pay the bill or something. Honestly, David, for someone who's supposed to be good with money, you can be so absent-minded. There was again the casual condescension, the immediate assumption that he was at fault, that he was the bumbling, incompetent provider who had failed in his simple duty. It was breathtaking in its arrogance. He felt no anger, only a profound, weary confirmation that he was doing the right thing. I'm sure it's just a technical issue, Isabella, he said smoothly. I'll look into it when I have a moment. When you have a moment, she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. I need it fixed now. I have the club's fundraising gala tonight, and I was buying the matching shoes for my dress. I'm in the middle of a very important meeting, he lied, though in a way, it was true. He was in the most important meeting of his life, the one where he finalized the terms of his own liberation. I'll handle it later. David, don't you dare hang up on me. He hung up. He stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it down on the desk. The silence in his office was absolute. He imagined her, standing on a busy street, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. For the first time in their 10 years together, the magic button had failed to work. The ATM had refused to dispense. The foundation had shown its first visible crack. An hour later, his phone rang again. This time it was Eleanor, Isabella's mother. He let go to voicemail. He already knew what the message would say. A torrent of passive-aggressive concern, veiled accusations of his incompetence, and a demand that he rectify the situation immediately so Isabella wouldn't be further distressed. He spent the rest of the afternoon with Marcus, going over the legal strategy. It was simple, elegant, and brutal in its efficiency. Since they had a prenuptial agreement, one that Isabella had laughed at, calling it unromantic and signing without even reading, and since all major assets were held in corporate trusts that predated the marriage, she was entitled to very little. A lump sum payment stipulated in the agreement, and nothing more. No house, no cars, no recurring alimony. It was designed to protect him, but more than that, it was designed to reveal character. A partner who was with him for love wouldn't care. A partner who was with him for money would be exposed. She'll fight it, Marcus said, reviewing the documents. Let her, David replied. We have receipts. We have phone records I subpoenaed this morning. We have the testimony of a private investigator I hired an hour ago to confirm Mr. Croft's identity. The fight will be public, messy, and she will lose everything, including her reputation. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You've been busy. I'm a meticulous man, David said, the words echoing Isabella's insult from the dinner party. I believe in thorough preparation. As he packed his briefcase to leave for the day, he felt a strange sense of calm. The storm was coming. He had spent the day methodically boarding up the windows, reinforcing the walls, and ensuring he was standing on the highest, most solid ground. Isabella and her family believed they were about to confront him over a minor financial inconvenience. They had no idea they were sailing into a hurricane of their own making, and he was the calm, quiet eye of the storm. He drove home, not to the sprawling mansion in the suburbs, but to his penthouse apartment in the city, a place Isabella had never seen, a place he had kept for himself, a quiet retreat from the life she had built around them. It was his true home, filled with his books, his music, and his peace. He made himself a simple dinner and ate it while looking out over the glittering expanse of the city he had helped to build. His phone buzzed incessantly with texts from Isabella and her mother. He ignored them. Tonight, he was gathering his strength. Tomorrow, he would face them. He had already set the stage. He had called Isabella back an hour earlier, his voice apologetic and placating. You were right, he'd said. It was a bank error. It's all sorted now. I'm so sorry you were embarrassed. He was lying, of course. The cards were still inactive. To make it up to you, why don't we have your parents over for dinner tomorrow night? I'll have catering bring in your favorite things. We'll celebrate the gala. She had accepted, her tone shifting from furious to smugly mollified. She believed she had won. She believed he had been properly chastened. She had no idea she was accepting an invitation to an execution. Her own. The air in the dining room was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the delicate scent of the sea bass and saffron risotto arranged on the table. The caterers had come and gone, leaving behind a meal worthy of a magazine cover. Richard and Eleanor were seated opposite David, their faces studies in barely concealed disdain. Isabella sat at the head of the table, presiding over the affair like a queen holding court. She had spent the day stewing in her indignation, and now she was ready to deliver her judgment. David, she began, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. She hadn't touched her food. We need to talk about this mess yesterday. David looked up from his plate. He had been eating slowly, deliberately. Mess? I thought we resolved it. I told you it was a bank error. A bank error that you, as the one who handles the finances, should have foreseen, Richard interjected, swirling the wine in his glass. It was a 1982 Bordeaux from David's cellar. In my day, a man took pride in ensuring his wife was never inconvenienced. It was more than an inconvenience, Daddy, Isabella said, her voice trembling with theatrical drama. It was a public humiliation. My friends are there. They saw me have to walk away from purchase. Do you know what that looks like? It looks like you have a husband who is perhaps a bit out of his depth, Eleanor added, her voice dripping with condescension. Running a household of this scale requires a certain attention to detail. It's not like designing a library, dear. David placed his fork and knife down on his plate, the silver making a soft click against the porcelain. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze calm and unervingly direct. He let their accusations hang in the air, a toxic perfume. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment they would reveal the full depth of their contempt, their utter blindness. They were so sure of their position, so confident in his weakness. You're right, David said softly. The quietness of his voice made them all lean in slightly. It does require attention to detail, and I have been paying very close attention lately. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope. He placed it on the table, a stark white rectangle on the dark mahogany. Isabella stared at it. What is that? A detail, David said. He slid the envelope across the table toward her. It stopped just short of her wine glass. Go on, open it. With a frown of confusion, she picked it up. Her manicured fingers fumbled with the flap. She pulled out the contents. It was the 3 hotel receipts, stapled neatly together. He had made high-quality copies. The originals were with his lawyer. She stared at them, her brow furrowed at first. Then, a flicker of recognition. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. She looked up at David, her mouth slightly agape. For the first time that evening, she was silent. I don't understand, Richard said, his bluster momentarily deflated by the sudden shift in atmosphere. What is that? Some sort of bill you forgot to pay. In a way, David said, his eyes locked on Isabella's. It's a bill that has come due. He turned his gaze to Richard and Eleanor. Those are receipts from the Grand Alistair Hotel. 3 separate 2-night stays last month. For a suite booked by a Mr. Julian Croft, a man who, my sources tell me, is a tennis instructor at your country club. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Richard's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, began to crumble. And the bill, David continued, his voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's blade, was paid for using the platinum card I provide for my wife. The card that was, as you so elegantly put it, inconvenienced yesterday at Chanel. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the wine fridge in the corner. Isabella's face was a ruin of its former composure. Panic and fear warred in her eyes. David, it's not what you think, she stammered, the words catching in her throat. Julian is just a friend. I was helping him. He was having financial trouble. David let out a short, mirthless laugh. It was a sound they had never heard from him before, and it was terrifying. Helping him? By booking a suite with champagne and room service for two? Isabella, please. Do not add insult to injury by assuming I'm a fool. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. The quiet, unassuming man was gone. In his place was someone they did not recognize, a man of immense control power. The decline card was not a bank error, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a quiet bomb that detonated in the center of the room. It was an instruction. My instruction. I canceled that card yesterday morning. And the Visa, and the department store accounts, and the fuel card. I canceled every line of credit that bears your name, but is backed by my money. Isabella's breath hitched. You can't do that. Oh, I can, David said. And I have. He then turned his attention to her parents, who were watching this exchange with growing horror. And Richard, Eleanor, I'm afraid I have some more details for you. The lease on your apartment is in my company's name. I've instructed my lawyers not to renew it. You have 30 days to vacate. Richard sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. You can't, that's our home. No, David corrected him gently. It was a home I provided for you out of respect for my wife. A respect, I now see, that was never reciprocated. He let that sink in before delivering the final, devastating blow. He reached into his briefcase, which he had placed on the floor beside him, and pulled out a thick, bound document. He placed it on the table with a solid, definitive thud. And this, he said, his voice resonating with the weight of absolute authority, is the deed to this house. I suggest you read it carefully. You'll notice it's not owned by me, David Miller. It's owned by the Miller Architectural Trust, an entity I established 5 years before I met Isabella. Her name appears nowhere on it. Legally, you're all guests in a home owned by my corporation, and I am now asking you to leave. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and absolute. The power dynamic, which for a decade had been tilted so heavily against him, had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The arrogant, condescending figures who had spent years treating him as a provincial simpleton were now staring at him with a raw, primal fear. Their faces, moments ago etched with disdain, were now slack with shock and dawning horror. Isabella was the first to break. A choked sob escaped her lips. David, no, you can't mean this. We're married. This is our life. No, Isabella, David said, his voice devoid of heat, filled only with a profound, sad finality. This was my life, which I chose to share with you. You, in turn, chose to share it with a tennis instructor. He gestured to the receipts, which lay on the table like a verdict. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Richard, recovering a fraction of his bluster, slammed his fist on the table. This is outrageous. We'll get lawyers. You can't just throw us out on the street. You are welcome to get lawyers, David replied, unfazed. I would recommend it. Marcus Thorne, my attorney, will be happy to speak with them. He has a file prepared. It contains this, he tapped the deed, and this, he tapped the receipts, along with our prenuptial agreement, which Isabella signed but I doubt she ever read. It's quite clear on the division of assets in a case like this, especially in a case of infidelity. At the mention of the prenup, Eleanor let out a low moan. She, unlike her husband, seemed to grasp the full, catastrophic scope of their situation. They had built their entire world on the assumption of David's pliancy and their daughter's control over him. They had mistaken his quiet patience for weakness. They had believed the foundation was dumb earth, and now they were discovering it was bedrock, and it was shrugging them off. But, my things, Isabella whispered, her eyes darting around the room, at the paintings, the sculptures, the very fabric of the life she had curated. My clothes, my jewelry. You may pack a suitcase with your personal belongings, David stated, his tone as unyielding as granite. Anything you purchased with the cards I provided will remain. We can have lawyers argue over which is which, but I suspect that would not be a pleasant process for you. As for jewelry, any pieces I gave you as personal gifts are, of course, yours. The larger, investment-grade pieces, however, are assets of the trust. They will be returned to the vault, He was thinking of the 10-carat diamond necklace she had worn to the gala, the one she claimed was a family heirloom from her side, a lie he had never bothered to correct. The desperation began to set in, a frantic, ugly scramble. "David, please," Isabella pleaded, her voice now stripped of all its artifice and pride. She pushed her chair back and tried to come to him, to touch him, to deploy the physical charms that had always worked before. "We can fix this. It was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake. I love you. You know I love you." David held up a hand, and the gesture stopped her cold. It was not a violent or angry motion, but it was absolute. A wall had been erected, and she could not pass. "Love?" he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. "Is that what you call it? The woman I loved would not have mocked me with her parents. The woman I loved would not have treated me like an employee. And the woman I loved would certainly not have entertained another man in a hotel suite using my money. I don't know who you are, Isabella, but you are not the woman I married." He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the room. "A car will be here in 1 hour to take you and your parents wherever you would like to go. A hotel, a friend's house. The choice is yours. I will be staying in my city apartment until you have vacated the premises. You have 24 hours to remove your personal effects. After that, the locks will be changed." He looked at the three of them, huddled together at the magnificent table, surrounded by the trappings of a life that was no longer theirs. They looked small, diminished, their arrogance stripped away to reveal the hollow, grasping need beneath. He felt no triumph, no pleasure in their ruin. He only felt a deep, cleansing sense of peace. The cancer had been cut out. The house was finally his. He turned and walked out of the dining room without a backward glance, the sound of Isabella's weeping following him down the long, marbled hall. The days that followed were a blur of frantic phone calls and hollow apologies. Isabella, oscillating between rage and tearful pleading, left dozens of voicemails. They were a masterclass in emotional manipulation. First came the threats. She would ruin him, tell everyone he was a monster, a cruel, vindictive man. Then came the bargaining. She would do anything, go to therapy, cut off her parents, and the affair that she now admitted was a terrible lapse in judgment. Finally, there were the pathetic, desperate pleas, filled with reminiscences of their early days, hollow echoes of a love that had long since withered. David listened to none of them. He had instructed Maria to transcribe them, to forward them to Marcus as evidence of her state of mind, but he did not subject himself to the emotional poison. He was an architect drawing up plans for a new life, and he would not be distracted by the noise from the demolition site of the old one. Her parents were even more predictable. Richard attempted to bluster his way into Marcus's office, demanding a meeting and threatening legal action. He was politely but firmly shown the door. Eleanor took a different tack, tried to appeal to David's better nature. She sent long, rambling emails about the sanctity of marriage, the importance of forgiveness, and the terrible stress Isabella had been under. She painted her daughter as a victim, a fragile flower who had been led astray, conveniently omitting the years of their own casual cruelty and financial dependence. David did not reply. There was nothing to say. Their words were meaningless, the desperate thrashing of people who had lost a game they didn't even know they were playing. They had mistaken his generosity for an obligation, and they could not comprehend that the source had been turned off. The true consequences began to ripple through Isabella's world with brutal speed. The first blow was social. News travels fast in her circle, and the news of a declined card at Chanel, followed by her sudden departure from her palatial home, was a juicy piece of gossip. Her friends, the ones who had flocked to her parties and vacationed on David's dime, suddenly grew distant. Calls went unanswered. Invitations dried up. Without the gravitational pull of David's wealth, her social star winked out overnight. She was no longer the queen bee. She was a cautionary tale. The second blow was financial. Stripped of her credit cards and her endless allowance, she was forced to confront a reality she hadn't known since she was a teenager. She had to check price tags. She had to consider a budget. She and her parents were staying in a cramped, 2-star hotel, paid for with the last of her father's dwindling trust fund. The shock was profound. The effortless luxury she had considered her birthright was revealed to be a privilege she had not earned and had now lost. 1 week after the dinner, Marcus arranged a final meeting. It was not a negotiation. It was a signing. Isabella arrived alone. She looked haggard, her expensive clothes seeming to hang off her diminished frame. The defiance was gone, replaced by a weary, hollowed-out resignation. They sat in Marcus's sterile conference room, a long, polished table between them. David was there, calm and composed in his gray suit. He had not seen her since that night. Looking at her now, he felt a distant pang of pity, but it was overshadowed by the certainty of his decision. "The terms are as we discussed," Marcus said, his voice all business. He slid the divorce settlement across the table. "As stipulated by the prenuptial agreement, you will receive a one-time payment of $250,000. In exchange, you waive all future claims on Mr. Miller's assets, properties, and corporate holdings. It's all very straightforward." Isabella stared at the document as if it were a death sentence. "$250,000? She whispered, her voice hoarse. "David, my wardrobe is worth more than that. The car you just took back was worth almost that much." "The car was a corporate lease, Isabella," David said, speaking for the first time. His voice was not unkind, merely factual. "And the wardrobe was purchased with funds I provided. This settlement is what we agreed to 10 years ago. It is fair and legally binding." "Fair?" She looked at him, her eyes finally filling with genuine, unfeigned tears. "You're taking everything from me." "No," David said, and his gaze was steady, forcing her to meet it. "I'm taking back what was always mine. What you had was on loan. You confused a lease for ownership. That was your mistake. My mistake was allowing it to go on for as long as it did." He let the silence stretch, forcing her to confront the truth of her situation. She was not a partner who had been wronged. She was a dependent who had been cut off. Her parents, the silent enablers who had propped up her sense of entitlement, were nowhere to be seen. They had made their choice, siding with their daughter, and now they were facing the consequences alongside her. They had gambled on David's weakness and lost everything. With a trembling hand, Isabella picked up the pen. She looked at the signature line, then back at David, one last, desperate appeal in her eyes. He gave her nothing. His expression was neutral, a closed door. She had sought a man of status and wealth, believing that was the source of power. She had never understood that his true power lay in his integrity, his self-respect, and his unwavering refusal to be devalued. She signed the papers. The stroke of the pen was shaky, but it was final. She pushed the documents back across the table. Her shoulders slumped. The fight was over. She had lost. As she stood to leave, a broken and diminished figure, David spoke one last time. "Isabella," he said, and she paused, her back to him. "For what it's worth, I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope you learn to build a life of your own, instead of just decorating one someone else has built for you." She didn't answer. She simply walked out of the room, out of the building, and out of his life. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound as final and as liberating as the one he had heard when he left their home for the last time. The deconstruction was complete. It was time to start building again. 3 months later, David stood on the balcony of his city apartment, a glass of wine in his hand. The city spread out before him, a glittering tapestry of light and life. The air was crisp, clean. The silence in his home was no longer a retreat, but his natural state. It was a silence of peace, of order, of a life brought back into alignment with his own values. The mansion in the suburbs had been sold. He had no desire to live in a place so haunted by memories of a false life. He had donated a significant portion of the proceeds to a charity that built homes for the underprivileged, an act of architectural karma. The rest was reinvested, put back to work building new things. He had heard snippets of news about Isabella and her family. They had moved to a small, rented condo in a less fashionable part of the state. Richard had been forced to find a job for the first time in 40 years, something in sales, and was reportedly miserable. Eleanor had vanished from the social scene entirely. Isabella, he had heard from a mutual acquaintance, was working as a hostess in a restaurant. The story was a source of gossip and schadenfreude for her former friends, but for David, it brought no pleasure. It was simply the logical outcome of a life lived without a foundation. Gravity had finally taken effect. His life, in contrast, had blossomed. Freed from the constant, low-level stress of being undervalued, his work had reached new heights. He had just won the prestigious Pritzker Prize for a new museum design, a building of breathtaking simplicity and profound strength. At the award ceremony, he had given a speech not about architecture, but about integrity. The strongest structures, he had said, are the ones that are true to their materials, true to their purpose, and true to their foundations. The same is true of a life. Marcus had joined him on the balcony, holding a glass of his own. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two old friends who had weathered a storm together. "You know," Marcus said, looking out at the skyline, "I saw her the other day. Isabella." David didn't turn. "Oh, yeah, she was getting on a bus. She looked normal. Just a person, you know? Not the queen of the gala. Just a woman on her way home from work." David nodded, taking a sip of his wine. "I hope she's okay," he meant it. The anger and the pain had long since faded, leaving behind a clean, clear space. He held no ill will towards her. She was simply a part of his past, a lesson learned, a flawed structure that had been safely demolished. "You're a better man than I am," Marcus chuckled. "So, what's next for the world-famous David Miller? Designing a city on Mars?" David smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that had been absent from his face for years. "No, something much more complicated. I'm designing a small beach house, just for me." It was the truth. He was pouring all his skill and passion into a small, elegant home on a secluded stretch of coast. It would be a house of wood and glass and stone, a place that was honest, strong, and open to the sea. It was a home for the man he had always been, the man he was finally free to be. Later that evening, he had a date. Her name was Clara. She was a university professor, a woman with a quick mind and a kind laugh. He had met her at a lecture on urban planning. They had talked for hours about books and cities and the nature of beauty. She knew him only as David, the architect. She was impressed by his mind, not his wallet. When he had picked her up for their first date in his modest, 10-year-old sedan, she hadn't blinked an eye. He was taking it slow, building something new brick by brick on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. He knew there would be challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not been broken. He had been tested and had discovered the true nature of his own strength. It wasn't in the bank accounts or the property deeds. It was in his quiet dignity, his unwavering integrity, and his courage to demand the respect he deserved. He had lost a wife, but he had regained himself. And in the quiet, meticulous, and finally peaceful world of David Miller, it was the best trade he had ever made. The house he was building for himself would be small, but its foundation would be indestructible. And so, David's story comes to a close, not with a bang, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. It's a powerful reminder that our true worth is not reflected in the things we own or the people we impress, but in the integrity with which we live our lives. The respect we give ourselves is the foundation upon which everything else must be built. When we honor that, we create a structure that no storm can tear down. What did you think of David's decision? Was it justice, or was it too harsh? I'd love to read your perspective in the comments below. Your thoughts and discussions are what make this community so incredible. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more tales of karma, justice, and the quiet strength that lies within us all. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, build your life on solid ground.